What's
And
going
we're
on?
back.
Samuel?
G'day, boys and girls. Ross K. Nichols, the author of the Moses Scroll that you can see just over his shoulder behind him. There it is. If you don't have a copy of that, hey, g'day to Alexander, by the way, who I was talking to earlier in the week, I believe in Canada, who has a copy of your book. He's about to read it.
Good.
But the Moses Scroll is the book that we've been talking about for quite a while now. And Jono Vandor, here I am. You and I are going on tour
That's right.
very, very soon, boys and girls, and we would love for you to join us, the Tanakh Tour. And tickets are available at tanakhtours.com. There is the link right there. Egypt, Jordan is the first leg of this year's Tanakh Tour, kicking off on the 31st of October.
Yep.
And then on the 12th of November, running back to back, the second leg of the tour, of course, is Israel. And we can't wait. So there is still tickets available. We would love for you to join us. And once again, that is happening. And first time actually for us to go to Egypt, so we're very excited about that.
Yeah, man. In fact, let me just say, I just posted on Facebook. I'm reading, or I plan to read before we go, a particular book, and it's called "The Cairo Geniza and the Age of Discovery in Egypt." And you might say, well, why are you going to read that? Well, the Cairo Geniza is at the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Old Cairo. And one of the things that I'd like to do while we're there, I mean, we've got a lot of stuff to see, but after all, this is the Tanakh Tour, even though it's the ultimate Tanakh Tour. I want to go to this Geniza, this hiding place, supposedly. Within this synagogue were a lot of old manuscripts that were discovered, and some quite important finds were there at the Cairo Geniza. So I don't know yet. I mean, we're going to talk to the tour operator and see if we can get this in the itinerary, but I would love to do that. So anyway, I want to read this book and have it ready, in my head when we get to the Cairo Geniza. I mean, it would be Rebecca Jefferson, by the way, wrote that book, and so I have it. Just haven't got to it yet in my list. So
looking forward to learning more about that. G'day to Christo, who just tuned in. G'day, mate. He's coming with us, of course. Now, listen.
Yep.
We touched on last week the topic of Bible criticism.
Yeah.
I mentioned that you are reading a book by Emmanuel Tov.
That's right.
And when one refers to, Ross, when one refers to Bible criticism, scholarly criticism of the Bible, people often think of people who criticize the Bible. And that is to say, there are many comedians that we often hear that will focus in on a soft target in usually in the New Testament, the Christian Bible, and just go to town with it and make a plethora of jokes.
Yeah.
But not just comedians, but big name scholars. Richard Dawkins, for example, has been known to go quite hard on the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as he refers to it, and this sort of criticism leaves ill feelings towards such people from people of faith. And so when they hear that you, my dear friend, are reading a book on Bible criticism, they think, why would you want to? Who are you to criticize the Bible, Ross? Who are you to criticize the Bible?
That's right. That's right. Who are you to criticize the Hebrew Bible? In fact, one of the comments that I saw on last week's discussion was stick with criticizing the New Testament. Typically people oriented towards the Hebrew Bible will say, don't bring that over here. Keep that on New Testament text. Well, the first thing we have to do is kind of alleviate some of the concern, I think, sort of dispel some of the myths, even though we touched on it before. I want to explain that this is not critical biblical scholarship, is not criticizing as in severely or unfavorably looking at a text. That's not what we mean at all. There is a much better definition, which we're going to get to. Hello, Linda Hill. I just saw, and James Coates.
Hey, g'day, Linda.
James Coates is on. James, by the way, posted a picture of a musician playing a guitar the other day.
I saw that.
That
I did see that.
Similar
like you.
to me, yeah.
Yeah, I can see it.
So anyway,
Um,
welcome, guys. Yep,
Now, listen, you have, and speaking now, Linda was with us on the last tour, as was your son Toby. Your son Toby is in the uh, movie business. He's an actor,
yep,
and we often hear of critiquing a movie, and that's not so harsh to our ears. When we think of someone critiquing a movie,
yep,
it's like, I like the cinematography, the acting, the this and the costumes and the script was great and the storyline and done. And there's so many different levels to a movie or a TV series or a documentary that we would analyze and give an opinion on. And and in that sense, it's not so harsh to one's ears to critique a movie.
yeah.
Uh, is it similar? Would you say the approach to the Bible to critique the Bible in the same way?
That's a much better way to think about it. I looked up because I know what most people think when they hear biblical criticism is exactly like you described. But Merriam-Webster dictionary puts it this way: there's one definition most people wrongly assume we're talking about, and that's the one you described: to criticize,
Mm,
to make fun of, to belittle, to
mm,
speak disparagingly. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is another definition. This says the exercising or involving careful judgment or judicious evaluation, including in a decision variant readings and scholarly emendations. Now, that's sort of a mouthful, and it's not something that's going to be on the test this afternoon, though it ought to be. But the idea that we're looking at is when we talk about the Bible, the Hebrew Bible in particular,
mhm.
that's what we're concerned with in our discussions.
Yeah.
What do we really mean? We really mean looking at the biblical text with an S, plural, and really making some careful judgments, judicious evaluations, considering, let's say, variant readings, which even that makes people a little bit nervous. But one thing I'd like to do, Jono, is, you mentioned that I'm reading this book by
Mhm.
Manuel Tove, and one of the things that I really like is in the opening words of his book, in the introduction, in fact, it says this. It says, a man who possesses common sense, and you can read woman in there too, man or woman, who possesses common sense and the use of reason must not expect to learn from treatises or lectures on textual criticism anything that he could not, with leisure and industry, find out for himself.
For himself. That's a
And
really good quote. I like that a lot. Mm,
yet this is from Hausman, the application of thought to textual criticism from 1922.
mhm,
So, textual criticism deals with the nature and the origins of various biblical witnesses, textual witnesses, and it's really about trying to discern or to find within these variants what we might call the original form. Okay,
mm,
what's the earliest source for a certain pericope or a certain section of text? We've mentioned before, even the 10 words, the 10 commandments, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, both claim within that text, within their narrative, to be the words spoken from Horeb, from the
mm.
midst of the fire on the day of the assembly. They don't agree. Now, a lot of people just kind of rush through that, and they don't really look back. They don't check up. They don't slow down. I want to know which one of those versions
Is more accurate
represents closer, at least, to the original
to
form.
the
I want to
original.
know what was spoken from Horeb.
Now, when you put it that way, the first thing that goes through people's minds, and we've had the discussion about why we are no longer fundamentalists, and when we say fundamentalism, we say we're referring to the idea, and I say this for the sake of saving time, but people understand what I'm talking about. Uh, Fundamentalism from the idea that the Bible fell from the heavens as it is, and this is the inerrant truth. This is the divinely imparted knowledge. This is the book that you must learn and understand, and you must not question it. It's the
Right.
way it's supposed to be, so on and so forth. But you and I have been asking the question over the last few years more so, and we even mentioned this to each other before we went on air. What was the Bible, if you like, or what was the sacred text? I prefer the statement, the sacred text prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you can ask that question,
Yeah.
because there are some differences in the Dead Sea Scrolls to what we have now, of course. And if you go back further and you say, okay, well, let's go back a couple of centuries from there, and what did they consider sacred text? And
Right.
prior to that, because even the evolution of or the addition of books happened over time. They didn't all just write back in the day of Moses, right? Although some apologists would spin it that way.
Yeah.
For example, when you mention that the two accounts of the 10 words, the 10 commandments, do not agree, there is some rabbinic explanations, for example, that say, well, you see, God spoke both of those at the same time.
Right.
And that's the best that they can do with it, of course.
Yeah.
And that's not satisfying to many of us. So the common sense, as you mentioned, the rational deduction should be which one of those, both of those can't be true. Which one is more accurate to the original? And you have to just pop that bubble of it came to us as a complete package, and it's always been that way.
Yeah,
Ross?
that's right. And to that point, the biblical accounts, though someone might say, well, that nothing else matters, it's the biblical accounts, and some might try to dismiss the what they would say are the minor differences between those two and just say, yeah, you're straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, you're picking away. But those aren't the only accounts. I mean, obviously, Shapira manuscript has an account. Some people would say, well, that's not in my Bible, I don't want to hear about it. But you also have the Nash Papyrus. You have various other ancient sources. We have Dead
Mm,
Sea Scrolls. I have the manuscript. These are called, these books are available on Amazon, the Biblical Qumran Scrolls. And if you just flip through it, you'll see that every text, this is Hebrew text of
hmm
every transcriptions of every manuscript that we have of the biblical text from the Qumran manuscripts.
mm,
And so you basically, what we're talking about, there is this very fundamentalist view, such as advanced in books like this. And
yeah.
yes, I was caught up in that for a while.
We
The
might talk about that one day. That is a
We
very,
might, yeah. I
it's a
mean,
fun topic.
it
We'll
is
come
a
back to that
fun
one day.
topic.
Mm.
I even have that's part one, Jono.
Oh, no.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, that's the hardback. The second
You've
version
got
is
the hard
called
copy as well.
part two. Yeah, so there's, yeah,
Oh,
here it
dear.
is, the Bible Code, the countdown. This is
Mm.
the Bible Code 2.
Oh, quick. All right.
So you have that view, and then you have
Mhm.
another view where you say, I want to know, like we're saying, we believe that this divine event happened at Horeb. What were those words that were spoken, and can we get back to that original text?
Mm.
That's what we mean when we talk about critical, and we're going to expand this greatly. But the biblical texts were transmitted over a long period of time. I think everybody realizes that, and we're
Yeah,
going to
well,
get, yeah,
everybody should. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say
yeah,
Timothy Daly said, thinking critically equals thinking carefully. I'd agree with that.
that's right,
Derek
right.
just tuned in and said, "G'day, guys." G'day,
Hey,
Derek. Say
Derek.
g'day to Anna for us.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Um,
So, yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so the biblical text, first of all, you want to define the biblical text. And as we're doing our discussions week after week, for us, we're talking about the Hebrew Bible. We're not talking about the New Testament in this show. We're talking about
No.
the Hebrew scriptures that are presently in the Jewish Bible, consist of 24 books, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. But even when you talk about those books and the numbering of them as 24, originally, was that the case? Is the
Mm.
number of the books even the same? What about the order and arrangement? if you look at the current Hebrew Bible, Chronicles is Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles 1 and 2 are the way that the Hebrew Bible ends today, the Jewish Bible. But if you look at the oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible, it's the Leningrad Codex.
Mm-hmm.
It's called B19A. That order is not the same. It doesn't end with Chronicles. So you're like, well, first of all, I want to know how do you put your hands around what is the Hebrew Bible? And then how would you arrange the books if you did? You
Mm.
know, if you had the right material, in what order would you put it in? So if somebody picks up a modern printed Bible, a Hebrew Bible, such as the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is a academic version of the Leningrad Codex, is that the order that those books are in? You know, they
Mm-hmm.
claim to go by the Leningrad Codex, but it ends in Chronicles, and that's
Sure.
not. You see what I'm saying? So before you kind of alluded to this just a few minutes ago, one of the things that's very important to know is prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So winter 1946-47, before the Bedouin boys go into Cave One, the oldest manuscript of the Bible, excluding the discovery of the Nash Papyrus,
Mm-hmm.
the oldest Hebrew Aramaic text of the Bible dates to what? It's 1,000 years old,
Mm-hmm.
basically. And so the critics, using the definition that we talked about, being critical, pointing, making fun of, the
Right.
critics of the Hebrew Bible
The
then said,
scoffers.
do what?
The scoffers, can we say that?
Yeah, the scoffers.
Mm.
The scoffers would say, you claim this goes back to the time of Moses and the biblical period. Uh, how do we know when the oldest manuscript only dates to 1,008 BCE or
Mm.
1,009 CE,
Mm.
AD, as many people call it? So that was what they said. Now, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, that gives us Hebrew manuscripts dating back, 100 years BCE to about 150 CE. So it takes it back another 1,000 years. But even then, Jono, that's not to the biblical period.
Mm-hmm.
You realize, I mean, if you're talking about 2,000 years ago, you have to go back 2,500 years
Mm.
just to go to the biblical period, basically, right?
Right.
So that's one of the things that I want to do is I want to identify what's the earliest. What do we have? And quite honestly, the earliest text of the Bible we have are those that are discovered in caves at Qumran. Now, a whole nother argument is, does older always mean better? So, for instance, we have in our modern Hebrew Bibles the book of Isaiah
Mm-hmm.
from the Masoretic text, but that dates to 1,009 CE. Well, when you look at the great Isaiah scroll found in Cave One, that puts you back to about 100 BCE. So it's another 1,000 years.
Mm.
So when you compare the two, you have to say, do they agree? Well, let's leave that just for a moment and talk about our current Hebrew Bibles are based on mainly the Masoretic text, which is primarily comes to us in medieval text,
Mm-hmm.
such as those found in the Cairo Geniza. So you're back to this time about 1,000 years old.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're comparing, if I want to know what the original text is, where do I go?
It is an
What do I
interesting
look
thing
at?
to me once you realize the gravity of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have not. I mean, it's you would expect that there would be a more common book on our shelves the Bible according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, you and I, of course, we just showed we have the complete Dead Sea Scrolls, but a Bible that includes that defers back to the Dead Sea Scrolls when we have those fragments,
Yeah,
and putting that in as the primary text, if you like, because it is older. It's an
that's right.
older source. It seems like that should be more common, doesn't it, Ross?
It really does, Jono. And the thing that I've begun to really try to work on is, I teach the Hebrew Bible. So when I teach the Hebrew Bible, I want to begin there. That's my base text. So what I'd like to do is I want to consider other texts, and I'm beginning to do this more and more. And I see the question. I'm going to pop it
Okay,
on the screen in just a minute.
good one.
But we have, not only do we have the Masoretic text, which is the basis from which we begin, but
Mm.
we also want to look at what are the variants that are out there. So, for instance, you look at the Hebrew of the Masoretic text, and you compare that with if we look at the Pentateuch, for instance, you can look at not only the Septuagint, but you can look at the Samaritan
Hmm.
Pentateuch. You can look at various things. So here's an example, a good question from Timothy Daly. He says, do you have any examples where the Dead Sea Scrolls are closer to the LXX? And the LXX is the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. And the answer to that, Timothy, is yes, we do. And in fact, there's even more to say on that, because we're going to do a discussion just on the Septuagint later. But let me whet your appetite just a moment. So I'm currently teaching the book of Jeremiah.
Hmm.
And when you think about Jeremiah, the Septuagint places the rebukes to the nation, or the burdens to the nations. In the Masoretic text, it begins in chapter 46 of Jeremiah and goes through 50 or 51. But in the Septuagint, it begins in chapter 25. The placement is there at chapter 25. I actually think that represents closer to the original for several reasons. I'm going to get into that in my Jeremiah series every Saturday. We're going to be
Hmm.
talking more about that. Not only that, but the Septuagint, sort of piggybacking off of Timothy's question, the Greek of the Septuagint quite often is closer to the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scroll Jeremiah text,
Hmm.
which indicates the story is that these scholars translated from a version of Jeremiah in Hebrew to produce the Septuagint Greek. But the Hebrew of the Masoretic text in Jeremiah doesn't really go that closely, whereas the Septuagint does. So hopefully that kind of answers a little bit of that.
Just while we're on, I don't want to go down a rabbit trail here, but you're going to have to refresh my memory, because I seem to recall that there is a story about an ancient, what appeared to be an ancient version of Jeremiah that Shapira obtained and sold, and we never saw it again. Can you
That's
refresh
true.
my memory on that?
Yeah, that's true. I'll touch on that. So, one of the texts that Shapira comes across in the 1800s is a scroll of Jeremiah that supposedly was found by Arabs, and they brought it to him, and he sold it from his shop. Now, we're actually trying to track this down. I have an article that I wrote on Shapira's magnificent manuscript of Jeremiah. It's on my academia page, and it's on my Moses Scroll blog. So
Hmm.
people might want to check that out. But here's the thing. So people laughed at him. They laughed at this idea. Oh, here goes Shapira. He's got an ancient version of Jeremiah. Well, guess what? I think he actually did.
Mm.
And so we're looking for this. We've actually got some clues, Jono, about who bought this manuscript, and so
Can
I
you
wouldn't give
imagine?
up. Good.
Can you
Yes.
imagine if we were to encounter that? And not to stay too long on the topic, but do you recall off the top of your head the year in which this sale occurred?
I don't remember exactly. It is in my article. I
We'll
had
read the
that
article later.
number fresh in my
But
mind.
he did make mention that there were some differences, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
So you have to
fascinating.
wonder.
We'll have to
Now,
find that.
again, this is a classic example of careful, as Timothy described it, or critical scholarship when you look at Jeremiah. When you look at Jeremiah and you say, Jeremiah, according to the Septuagint, reads a certain way, the Masoretic text reads something different. The chapters aren't in the same order between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. Now, there are people who say, I don't care what the Greek says, Jono, I'm going with the Hebrew.
Mm,
But that only matters if you don't acknowledge the fact that the Greek was translated from the Hebrew. And if the Hebrew that the Greek came from represents that earlier source,
mm,
well, now we're into a whole nother question.
mm,
So we want to talk about now we're talking about, I touched on Jeremiah, the books being out of order, and I'm getting into all of that good stuff on Saturday mornings. But I want to say another thing about, not only is the book of Jeremiah, the chapters not in the right sequence, they're clearly out of order,
mm,
but there are other things about various versions of the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, that don't agree. If you look at the Leningrad Codex, what we know about the Aleppo Codex, and what we know about the Sassoon Codex 1053, which, by the way, happens to be on display in Israel at the moment.
Oh, I read about that. Yeah,
That's right.
boy, that'd be great to have a look at.
But they don't agree. So let me just take a deep breath here and say, okay, if you look at these Masoretic manuscripts, Leningrad, now remember, most of the Torah or the Pentateuch is missing from Aleppo.
Mm,
So let's look at Leningrad and Sassoon, and you compare those two. One thing they are very, now that there are minor differences, not a lot of
mhm,
major. Understand, I'm not being picky here, but when you look at them, they are different. And when you look at the text, you're looking at handwriting
mhm,
that is 1,000 years old, Jonah.
mm,
So first of all, you're looking for accents and punctuation and nikudot, the vowel points. They're not always the same. Well, as most people know who study Hebrew, the pointing makes all the difference in the world sometimes.
mm,
Sometimes if you use different nikudot, you're going to produce a different word.
mm,
So we have behind I'm just throwing out some general ideas tonight. If we look behind the text of the Masoretic text, we see the consonantal form of the text. That is fairly consistent. In other
right.
words, even though the vowel points might be different, producing different words between, say, Sassoon and the Leningrad Codex, the consonants are the same.
Okay.
And so that needs to be set up front. But again, sometimes the pointing makes all the difference in the world.
Mhm.
But we do have some differences. Look, if you don't mind, open any Bible and read for me Proverbs 8:16.
8:16.
Yeah, Proverbs 8:16. This is just one example that I want to bring up,
Mhm.
because it's one of the texts that there is, and I mean one, not meaning like I can only come up with one. I'm giving one tonight as an example.
This
Okay.
is the one that I'm reading from. Okay. Uh, Through me princes rule, great men, and all the righteous judges, Ross.
Yep. Okay.
Mhm,
Perfect. So some of the Hebrew manuscripts where you read righteous judges,
mhm,
what the translators of the JPS are picking up on is a phrase in Hebrew, shoftei tzedek, righteous judges.
yeah,
All right. Well, there is another very popular variant in ancient manuscripts here that says Shoftei Aretz, judges of the earth.
So
Now,
a difference in the vowel points?
not only a difference in the vowel points, but a difference in the consonants,
Mm-hmm.
because tzedek and aretz don't have the same
Right,
consonants.
righteousness and earth. Yeah, sure.
So what we have there are two traditional readings preserved in manuscripts of Hebrew text.
Mm-hmm.
Leave the Greek out. Somebody says, well, I don't trust the Septuagint, it's Greek. I only trust Hebrew manuscripts. This is just one example of a variation within Hebrew text. Now, let's look. Let me tell you one thing about the Leningrad Codex, for instance. The Leningrad Codex is, because of its honorable position as the oldest complete version of the Masoretic text. You know, when all this stuff came out about Codex Sassoon 1053, it says it is the oldest nearly complete. Why do they say that? Because it's missing a little bit of the Genesis and it's missing a couple of pages elsewhere. Leningrad Codex has it all, man. It dates to 1009 CE. It is clearly, at present, the earliest textual witness in Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible. So there are five versions of the Masoretic text, Hebrew Bible, that claim to be faithfully based on the Leningrad Codex. They are
Mm-hmm.
the Biblia Hebraica, which was the first version of the Leningrad Codex, according to the German Bible Society. German biblical scholars are wonderful. And then it was revised later as the BHS, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. It's currently under revision again. That was the BHS. Now we have the BHQ that is currently being prepared now. It's available. Many of the books of the Bible have been complete, but it's not all complete. And it's very, very expensive to get these volumes. I don't own them yet. I hope
Mm-hmm.
to one day. And then we have the ADI version, ADI, and the Doton edition. I do have the Doton edition.
Okay.
All of these claim to be based on the Masoretic text of the Leningrad Codex, and they don't agree. Here we go. Here's a quote from Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, Emmanuel Tov.
Go
Quote,
ahead.
no single edition, Jono, in existence agrees in all its details with another one, except for photographically reproduced editions, meaning if I have a BHS large
Sure.
edition and a BHS small edition, they match exactly if they're
Sure.
produced in the same year. If it's
Mm-hmm.
a revision, you're going to find differences. Or editions presenting the same electronically computer encoded text. So we've got this dilemma, and sometimes does it really matter if the original text was the judges of the earth, or what was the other, the righteous judges? Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to look at, say, let's use this example. If I want to really know what Proverbs 8:16 is, let's say, Jono, that I'm running for judge in my town. I'm not qualified, but if I were, I would say, I want to put on my banner, Ross K. Nichols, a
Mm-hmm.
righteous judge, Proverbs 8:16. But then someone at home says, what's Proverbs 8:16? And they look it up and their Bible says, judges of the earth. Ross wants to be a judge of all the earth. What is that? That's a term used for God. He's claiming
I'd,
that. You can
I'd
see
love
how
to
this
be a
could get
judge of
off
all
the
the
chain. Yeah.
earth. Sure.
So we have to wonder, how do these, let's call them corruptions or variations or
Mm-hmm.
differences, get into the text? Well, the answer to that is easy and it's complex. In some ways, you have to understand that the producers of, say, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, they're producing a typed version of what's before them, which was handwritten.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to rely on that person to look at the manuscript, handwritten manuscript, and accurately produce in type what they see before them in handwriting.
Mm.
And so that's one way it could creep in. Somebody reads a word one way, and somebody, let's say they represent a het instead of a hey, very
Mm-hmm.
similar letters, or a
Mm-hmm.
kaf instead of a bait.
Or a resh instead of a dalet. I mean, these
A
things are easy.
great example.
Mm.
Now, there are safeguards in place. Let me give you an example. The example you just gave, a dalet or a resh. I'm going to tell you of a tragic thing that could happen if a scribe makes a mistake. If you look at Deuteronomy 6:4, most of our viewers probably know Deuteronomy 6:4 in Hebrew. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It ends in a dalet. If, God forbid, a translator, a transcriber looked at the dalet at the end and put a resh, he would say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is another God,"
Hmm.
right? It would say, instead of achad, you would say achar or acher, which would mean something that's not
Mm.
kosher.
Mm.
So the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible in most editions has the dalet enlarged. Did you know that? If you look
I
at it,
didn't know that. I
it's
did
something
not
you'll
know that.
see in most of the translations.
Yeah, Christo just said that 2 letters are enlarged in the Torah scrolls, explained exactly in this, in a sermon I gave a couple of years ago. Okay,
That's
so he's
right.
well aware. G'day
That's
to
right.
Patty, by the way. Patty just, dropped in and says hello. Patty
Hey,
Tyler.
Patty. Yep. So there are some things that are very, very important. Deuteronomy 6:4, you have to get right. In fact, as Christo said, when you look at Deuteronomy 6:4, it has the beginning ayin
Mhm.
and the ending dalet are both enlarged and bold. So God forbid you don't make a mistake with that, right? But there are places where single letters or entire words are mistaken. The example I gave of a bait and a kaf, when the BH, the Biblia Hebraica edition, came out, Isaiah 35 says, I know the song, so let me try to quote it. Yesasum, Yesasum bar vetzia, vetegel arva. It's about in the end days, the desert will rejoice.
Mhm.
And one of the words in there is kahavatzelet. The desert will blossom like a rose. But instead of the initial kaf, a bait was reproduced in the Biblia Hebraica edition. And instead of saying like a rose, it would mean in
In.
a rose or
Mm.
with a rose. The desert will blossom. So you could go, well, that's all right. The desert will blossom with the rose, but it's not what the
The
actual
intention
manuscript
of
said.
Sure. G'day,
Again,
Vicky.
yeah. So some of these examples aren't that huge, but
Mm.
there are some that are important. Another thing that happens is we get examples where something hasn't survived to this day. I'll give you an example. And by the way, I love these because again, being critical doesn't mean we're making fun. To me, this is an example that a scribe is accurately producing what's in front of them
Mm.
and they're not adding to it. Look at 1 Samuel 13:1. This is the example I'll give on this one.
Mhm.
1 Samuel 13:1. And we're going to talk about the reign of King Saul. And I'm curious what the JPS translators do there.
1 Samuel 13:1.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is an interesting text because the Hebrew text is missing some data and
I
some
love this. Look at this.
translators smooth it out. Ready?
This is
Go.
really good. Okay, so what I have is, the way that it's represented in this translation,
Yep.
Saul was ... You never see that. This is fascinating. So
I love it.
Saul was ... You don't usually have that. You would have a guess and then you'd have an explanation. He was ... years old when he became king and reigned over Israel 2 years. Now, if you go down, if I may, to the and there's a little A there. It says the number is lacking in the Hebrew text. Also, the
Ah.
precise context of the quote 2 years is uncertain. The verse is lacking in the Septuagint.
Ah,
Ross.
excellent. That is an excellent footnote, and it's why you and I both like the Jewish Study Bible,
For the
because they
footnotes.
have these scholarly notes which give you textual information.
Thank
So
you, Mark.
if I look at the Hebrew text as it's been preserved in the Masoretic text of 1 Samuel 13:1, it says Ben Shana Shaul Bamalko. That says literally a son of a year was Shaul when he began his reign, if you will. And then it says Ushte Shanim Malak al Yisrael, and he in 2 years he reigned over Israel.
Mm,
So what the JPS does there, and that's good, it says ... meaning he was this many years old. What the Hebrew here says literally is Saul was a year old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 2 years. Hey, that can't be right. So
mm.
the transcriber is left to say either we go with that, and the Bible is the inspired, inerrant, authoritative word, and by God, Saul was a year old when he began to reign, and he reigned until he was 3 years old. Or we say something's missing. Is there a way I can put this together, Jono? I'm doing a study. I'm writing a book on Saul. I want to know. So here's what I would do. I would first look within the biblical text and say, is there anywhere else that tells me how many years Saul reigned? Maybe. Is
Hmm.
there another text which tells me this, that, or the other? Or is there another text, for instance, from Qumran or from the Septuagint, that might give me the information that is
Offer
lacking,
clarity. Yeah, offer some
right?
clarity. Hmm.
So that's how we have to do critical scholarship. I'm going to tell you right now that Saul was not 1 years old when he began to reign. He was a grown man. We read the story in the book of Samuel. He was tall. He was handsome. He wasn't a little baby drinking out of a bottle. He was a grown man. And so we have to search for answers. And how do we do that, Jono? We simply use critical thinking and analytical, careful skills, and we discover that. So
Mm.
there again, I want to focus on critical biblical skills. We're going to give people the skill sets, Jono, to look text to text.
Hmm.
So one of the examples that we're going to get into is comparing what we call intertext, and I'm only going to touch on this. If we look at intertext within the Bible, we're
Hmm.
going to find that we have, for instance, 2 Samuel 22 has a harmonistic reading in Psalm 22. I'm sorry, Psalm 14. In other
Okay.
words, if
Yep.
you read the account in 2 Samuel 22, you look at Psalm 18. I may have messed that up a minute ago. Those two record that, but they're different. They have different
Hmm.
readings. Same thing goes for Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. How about Jeremiah 52 and 2 Kings 24:18 through 25:30? You get these different accounts.
Mm.
This is not criticizing the Bible. This is looking at those texts harmonistically, side by side, and making a judgment and saying the psalmist is taking what he knows from a text in Samuel, say,
Hmm.
and he's making certain changes. It's okay, but we want to know what was the original,
Which one came first? So
which
that reminds
came
me, and you
first.
and I have spoken about this before, and I touched on these verses when I presented a talk at the United Israel Conference. By the way, the 80th annual conference
That's
is
right.
coming up in just a matter of weeks in North Carolina. Is that right?
That's right. April 21 through 23. And if they sign up, I need to give people that link so you can go ahead and talk about it, and I will
Put that up
post that
quickly,
link.
and we'll go back to where you were. But Micah chapter 4 is some verses there that I was touching on, which concurs with Isaiah chapter. Where is it, Ross? Isaiah chapter.
Say again, which
Micah chapter 4 and
Micah 4 is Isaiah 2.
Isaiah
Yep.
2. And
Yep.
there are some differences.
There are.
There. And then the question there as well becomes, which one is first? Who's
That's right.
quoting from whom? What did the original look like? Just very quickly, g'day to Dave. Dave's there, and
Hey, Dave
they've been
Tyler.
traveling, he says, and they've just come back. I still have now. I've got all these questions in regards to Samuel chapter 13 because I opened up another Bible, a
Well,
Christian
go ahead and give
translation.
us
To see
that
what they
one
have.
because we're going to wrap it up in a minute. But I want people to let's think about that. What does this Bible say? What are you
Yeah, no,
reading from, and
it's
what does
just
it say?
fascinating. So this is a really good example, just to take a few different translations off the shelf and go, how do they deal with this? Especially if they are, quote unquote, study Bibles, and they'll
Yep.
have notes. See how they spin it. So what I have in this one, and this is the my trusty New King James, right?
All right.
Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men. Da 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 da. And then in the in the study notes it says 1 year, 2 years. This verse provides a chronological note recording the dates of this encounter with the Philistines relative to Saul's reign as king. And then it quotes from the New Testament, of course, Acts 13:21 reveals that Saul ruled over Israel 40 years. 2 years must refer to the period of reign up to a particular event, likely Saul's encounter with the Philistines described in this chapter.
That you know what that is?
Mm-hmm.
Yada 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 yada.
Little bit of sugar, a little
A
bit of
lot of
sugar
sugar.
sprinkled on top.
Because honestly, the text in 1 Samuel 13 clearly says that he was 1 year old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 2 years. But
Mm-hmm.
again, we don't have to leave it there. If we think critically,
Mm-hmm.
not criticizingly, but critically, we say, where else in the Bible do we find maybe a time frame for which Saul was king of Israel? And by the way, there are answers there. So when I do my studies, when I'm teaching the Pentateuch a new look, that's what I do. I look for other texts. What'd you
So
find?
I'm sorry to stick on this because I love this. This is great. So now I've just got the NIV. There we go, right?
Yep.
Study Bible. Saul was 30 years old when
30.
he became king. He reigned over Israel 42 years. And don't you
Yep.
love that?
Yep.
It's just great. Look, this is a fun little experiment for everybody to do. Grab a
Yep.
study Bible or various study Bibles off your shelf and just see what 1 Samuel 13, verse 1 says, and try and figure that one out. And you'll find that you've become a critical thinker of the Hebrew Bible.
That's
This is,
exactly right.
I
And
love
I'm
this one.
glad you did that, Jono, because if everyone watching now will go to the Bible of their choice, or if they have the
I'm on a
time, go to
roll.
Blue Letter Bible online and just pull up that verse and just click through. Look at the ASV, look at the RSV, look at the NRSV, look at this, look at that, look at the NESV, whatever, and see what
Mm-hmm.
they say. You're looking at another one. I can see now you're going to be looking at this all
I'm
night.
loving this. Now, this again, this is good. The New Oxford Annotated Bible, the New Revised Standard Version. It's a good machine. Saul was again years old when he began to reign, and he reigned and 2 years over Israel. And there's an explanation down there for that, and it'll be a little bit more honest and scholarly, I'm sure.
Yeah.
There's
One
some
one
homework for
point,
the
one
viewers.
one point, I'm sorry, Jonah, one point,
Go ahead.
Christo says, "This is why every translation is wrong, including mine." I would add one caveat. The reason in this case that the translations are wrong is that the Hebrew text is deficient. Now, when I say that, I want everybody to understand what you want to do is you want to say why. I've already said
Mhm.
I'm happy with it like that because it indicates to me that a scribe gets a text and he's looking at an ancient manuscript, and let's say part of it's smudged. And it says, and Saul was, I can't make that word out, Jono. What do I put here? I don't know, but don't add anything to it. Just leave it blank, or that's what we have in the Hebrew text. There are many other examples in the Hebrew text where this sort of thing goes on. We're going to
So,
cover plenty of examples like this.
in closing, Ross, let me just read from the Art Scroll, because the Art Scroll is the rabbinic, um, what we would call a dynamic text.
Yep.
So it has a little bit of spin to it, and this is 13 verse 1. It was in the first year of Saul's reign, there's an asterisk there, and then in brackets, he reigned over Israel for 2 years. Okay, that's interesting, parentheses. And as we go down to the study notes, its explanation is literally a year old Saul in his reign. And the narrative of this chapter occurred during the first year of his 2 year reign. As soon as his authority was accepted at Gilgal, he selected 3,000 soldiers, so on and so forth. But it's not literally a year old in his reign, it's literally a year old. Okay,
Let
interesting.
me now, you see, we keep saying we're going to do 45 minutes. I have to do one more. Christo
One more.
says, let me pull this up. He says, I wonder how Robert Alter rendered
Ah,
that. I'll pull the
you've got
volumes out later. I'm not going to let you do that before I do, Christo.
that.
So let me tell you, I love this is Alter's original work. I also
Hmm.
have the 3 volume set on my shelf, but it's the
Sure.
same. Beautifully, Alter is so faithful. I love Alter. He says Saul was blank brackets years old when he became king, and blank 2 years he reigned over all Israel. Listen to his note. The Masoretic text, notoriously defective at this point, Saul says Saul was a year old and 2 years he reigned. It's exactly what I said it said. This whole sentence is absent from the Septuagint, leading one to suspect that the redactor here stitched into the narrative a textual fragment in which there were lacunae in the numbers that he didn't presume to fill in. That sounds like what I said. He said there's a lacuna is a missing part, and he dared not add anything to it, but he wanted to include it. So the scribe was faithful here with preserving an ancient reading, but not adding to it. But our point is, what we don't want to presume is to do like some of these translations do and add things to the text. But we
Mm,
also want to be critical, and we also want to admit when the Hebrew Masoretic text is lacking something, though.
mm,
So we have to do that. Next week, when we come live, we're going to talk more about critically examining the Hebrew text of the Bible. And I think this is going to be an illuminating experience
mm.
for our viewers. I think people are going to get a lot out of this.
This has been fun, and I'm looking forward to more of this. Up in the corner of this page, boys and girls, there is Ross's Patreon QR code. And I'd like to encourage you, if you haven't gone there already, go and click on that, because within Ross's Patreon, there's more that he offers that if you like this, you'll love that. Various levels of contributions that you can make, including one level that will give you a discount on the Tanakh tour. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we mentioned we're doing 2 legs of the Tanakh tour this year. If you do sign up to both of those, you will receive a $100 combination discount as well. We would love to see you,
That's
dear
right.
viewers, in November.
And
Uh,
one final point on
Go ahead.
the Patreon, I do have a $3 level, and that's a dime a day, I call it. And I just tonight, thanks to the previous month's Patreon supporters, I just bought a extended version of Zoom. And what that means is I'm going to go live for my Patreon page on a Zoom link that they'll have that allows them to have one-on-one. I'm just going to go live by myself every so
Right.
often. I plan to do that, I think, on Wednesdays is what I'm looking at now. And I'm going to carve out some time, and I'm going to go live on a Zoom link that they'll have, and it gives them direct access. And we'll just do sort of a informal question and answer thing, sort of a perk.
Q&A.
So anyway,
Nice.
and you'll be
So I
welcome
won't
on
be
there
the only
anyway.
one to have that privilege.
That's
That
right.
is us. Dear viewers, thank you for tuning in. We will be back this time next week. And until then, have a great one.
Sign up for the Tanakh tour. We
Sign
want
up for
you
the
with
Tanakh
us.
tour.
Talk to you later. See you next
Bye.
week, Jono. Bye.